Welcome to the first in our series of Breaking Ground webinars. In this webinar, we will be covering the different types of insurance that you would typically encounter on a typical construction project. We will be briefly looking at professional indemnity, public liability, contract works, employer's liability, and property risk insurance. At the end of the session today, we will cover a hypothetical case study arising from a typical construction project to consider how each policy fits together to cover the different risks that may arise. I am joined today by my colleagues Miranda and Sam Morley, who also specialise in construction and engineering risks. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
Morning.
This session is being recorded, and whilst you can see us, we cannot see you. So let's get going. Miranda, I think firstly you're going to talk to us this morning about professional indemnity policies. What do they typically cover on a construction project?
So in simple terms, it covers the costs and expenses of defending claims of negligence or breach of civil liability brought by third parties against professionals. Essentially, claims then relating to errors made when providing your professional services. Anyone who provides professional services on a construction project should ensure they have professional indemnity cover in place. So whether you are a design and build contractor, specialist subcontractor, architect, engineer, contract administrator. Invariably, it will be a contractual requirement for you to have professional indemnity policy in place if you need to have it.
Great. And how is a professional indemnity policy typically triggered, Miranda?
So they're what we term as claims made policies. So it's the policy which is in place at the time the claim is made or circumstance arises, which is the policy that will respond. So even if that is sometime after the construction project is complete and your services are done with.
And what claims are typically excluded by a professional indemnity policy?
So key exclusions are pricing risk, claims relating to bodily injury, claims relating to property damage, and what I mean by that is damage caused by flood, fire, storm, etc., and workmanship. So the actual building or installation rather than the design or advice provided.
Great, thanks, Miranda. Moving on now, we're going to talk about public liability policies. Sam, what are they? What risks does a public liability policy typically cover?
Yeah, of course, Andrea. So the key risks that a public liability policy is intended to cover are claims brought against an insured relating to injuries to people, accidental damage to property, and accidental nuisance, trespass, and interference. The reference to injury to people does not cover claims brought by employees who have suffered an injury. As with the professional indemnity policy, this is a policy that covers the risks of claims brought by a third party. So basically anyone outside of the company that the business has contact with, including, for example, people visiting premises and even passers-by. The injury to a visitor or damage to property must have been caused in connection with trade or business as described in the policy wording.
So essentially, Sam, you mean the injury to the passerby or the damage to the property has to be caused by the works that you or your employees are actually carrying out on site?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Andrea. So to be clear as well, the injury caused or damage sustained must be accidental. So cover is only intended to cover unexpected events.
Yes, Sam, insurers aren't in the habit of paying out claims where there is a deliberate intent, which applies to all policies. Sam, when is a public liability policy triggered? Are they like claims made policies, like professional indemnity policies?
Yes, these ones are a little bit different, Andrea. So they're what we call event arising policies. So this means that the policy will only pay out for claims that arise out of loss or damage that actually happens during the typical 12-month policy period. It even covers claims for loss or damage that occurs during the policy period, but that do not come to light until much later. It's for this reason it's really important to make sure that the person within the company who's responsible for overseeing this policy is kept up to date with anything which has happened on site to ensure that it's notified to insurers.
Yeah, I think it's really important to stress that, Sam, that public liability policies are a legal requirement, that whoever has the legal responsibility for the site needs to ensure that this insurance is taken out. Sam, what's typically excluded by a public liability policy?
Yes, there's a few common ones that we'd expect to see. So any claims in relation to the insured's own property wouldn't be covered. Anything to do with the construction work taking place. So for example, any of the equipment or vehicles involved in the construction or the construction of the building itself. Any defective products which are supplied by the insured also wouldn't be covered. So for example, if there's a claim relating to defective glazing installed by the insured, any claim relating to that glazing would be covered by a separate product liability policy. The final common exclusion we see is any contractual liability where the insured has assumed liability under an indemnity agreement in a contract. So for instance, if an insured enters a contract which includes a provision saying that it will assume liability on behalf of someone else for third-party bodily injury or property claim, then a contractual liability policy will be required to cover this additional liability.
Thanks, Sam. That's really helpful. And moving on now, we're going to look at contract works policies. Miranda, what does the contract work policy typically cover?
So a contract works or contractors all risk policy is designed to cover works in progress on site. That provides cover for accidental risks of physical loss or damage to contract works, plant and machinery, whether hired or owned, employee effects, temporary structures, on-site materials, and third-party property damage.
And Miranda, is a contract works policy, is that a claims made or event arising policy?
It's an event arising policy. So it's the policy in place at the time of the loss, destruction or damage which responds. So a policy can be taken out to cover a specific project or on an annual basis to cover a number of projects.
And Miranda, what's typically excluded from a contract works policy?
So they don't cover damage to existing structures on site which do not form part of your contract works. And they are not designed to cover damage to property caused by defects. So these policies generally include a defective design exclusion, and these are tiered from DE1, being your lowest form of cover, up to DE5. DE1 is an outright defect exclusion. So all losses arising from defects in design, workmanship, and materials are excluded. The most common level of cover is DE3, which excludes cover for the property which is defective, whether that is due to a defect in design, workmanship, or materials, but does cover other property which is defect-free but damaged by the defective property. So these policies also don't cover liquidated damages, consequential loss, loss of use, penalties for delay or non-completion as a result of the loss, damage or destruction.
Thanks, Miranda. That's really helpful. Sam, I think you're now going to talk to us about employers' liability policy. What do they typically cover?
Yeah, so this is a policy covering third-party claims, and it basically covers injury or illness claims that might be brought against the insured by its own employees, where that employer has suffered an injury or illness as a direct result of the work for the insured. If you recall, when we discussed public liability policies, this was a specific exclusion. So as an example we may see on a construction project is if someone falls off a scaffold or is injured by equipment that they are operating.
So Sam, am I right in presuming that, like a public liability policy, an employee liability policy is an event arising policy?
Yeah, that's right, Andrea. So it will be the policy in place at the time the injury is sustained that responds. So this is even if a claim is not made until some time after that policy is expired. So an example we may see is in businesses whose employees were exposed to asbestos many years ago and become sick as a result, and were entitled to cover under the employer's liability policy at the time the employees were infected.
Thanks, Sam. I think it is also important to highlight that this is another policy which you're required to have by law. So anyone involved in the construction project that employs anyone should have employers' liability insurance in place. Sam, what are the common limits to employers' liability insurance?
So with these policies, you need to really carefully consider the wording. So some wording in some policies can restrict the definition of business, can exclude certain types of work, and exclude certain machines and processes. So the wording does need to be considered and ensure that it is appropriate for the needs of the business.
Great, thanks, Sam. Moving on now to the last policy we're going to look at this morning, which is property risk insurance. Miranda, what does a property risk policy typically cover?
So this is another policy that covers losses sustained by the insured rather than claims brought against them by others. So they're taken out by property owners or someone who's an interest in the property in possession of it. It covers damage to the property itself. Cover tends to differ widely and depends very much on the type of property to be covered, and insurers will specify the exact types of risk that they will cover. Generally, though, it tends to include cover for damage caused by fire, riot, storm, etc.
So again, Miranda, insurers are not covering deliberate acts.
Yes, arson isn't covered, I'm afraid. The policies will cover the costs of the works to repair the damaged property. Sometimes they may also include or cover for the cost of alternative accommodation, so if the property can't be occupied. And depending on the type of property, some policies also include business interruption cover.
Great. And what kind of damage to your property is typically excluded by a property risk policy?
Latent defects, gradual deterioration, wear and tear. So you can't just let your property go to rack and ruin and then expect insurers to pay for it. Corrosion, typically damage caused by wet rot or dry rot, faulty design or defective materials, or damage caused by pollution or contamination.
Great, thanks, Miranda. So Sam and Miranda have provided a really helpful overview this morning of what each policy does and does not cover. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have a look at a hypothetical scenario, bearing in mind what we've been told by Sam and Miranda. The facts of the scenario are as follows, and they're on screen now. Company A has been employed to carry out refurbishment works on a large hotel complex. During the refurbishment works, one of the steel beams supporting the roof collapses. This leads to the following series of events. The wall of the neighbouring property collapses. A construction worker is injured by the collapsing wall. A couple of diggers that are on site are damaged. And a brick from the collapsed wall breaks a window and damages a bathroom suite in a part of the hotel which does not form part of the refurbishment works. It is subsequently also discovered that the steel beam failed due to negligent design by the structural engineer. I guess the starting point is to determine what claims might arise out of this series of events. And Sam, I think you're going to take us through firstly what potential claims could arise from this series of events.
Yeah, that's right. So we'd expect the owner of the neighbouring property to want to make a claim to recoup the costs of rebuilding the wall. We'd expect the construction worker, if we assume that they are an employee of Company A, to make a claim in respect of their injuries. Company A will want to recover the cost of the damaged diggers and also want to recover the costs of the remedial works, so putting the steel beam back in place and rebuilding the roof. The employer will want to make a claim to cover the damage to the bathroom suite in the older part of the hotel. And finally, as we've been told that the steel failed because it was not designed correctly by the structural engineer, we'd expect Company A to want to make a claim against the structural engineer on the basis of that error.
Great. So now we know what claims will arise, and what we need to know is which of the policies is going to respond to those claims. We do have a poll this morning on the screen. Hopefully you should now see each claim, and you've got a list of policies to choose from. We would like you to take a few minutes to go through the questions and to vote what policies you think are likely to respond. We're going to give you a few minutes just to do this. There are 5 questions in total, and then we will have a look at the results together, and we will go through the answers. I can see the results on my screen, so there's quite a lot of variation, so this should be quite an interesting discussion. So first of all, what type of policy would respond to the neighbouring property owner's claim regarding the collapsed wall? Now, looking at the poll, 75% of you this morning think that public liability is the correct response. 2% professional indemnity. 18% of you have chosen property risk. Sam, can you reveal what's the appropriate response?
Yes, there's two possible answers basically to this one. So the first is the public liability policy, which it sounds like the majority of people have gone with. That would be on the assumption that there is no design issue. If we assume that there is a design issue, so with the steel beams that we mentioned about the structural engineer designing those, then it would be the professional indemnity policy that would respond. However, we would expect in this instance for the neighbouring property owner to first make a claim under its own property insurance, as that would be the easiest route. And then we'd expect their insurer to bring a subrogated claim against either Company A's public or professional liability policy.
Great, thanks, Sam. Turning now to question number 2, what type of policy would respond to the employee who sustained injury? 93% of people this morning have voted for employer's liability. Sam, is that the correct response?
Yes, it is, Andrea. So yeah, so it's again assuming that the wording was appropriate for the Company A's needs, as we discussed earlier, then the correct policy would be the employer's liability insurance. As we discussed, the public liability policy wouldn't be applicable here because that does generally include an exclusion relating to anything to do with employees.
Great, that's really helpful. Third question, what type of policy would respond to the contractor's claim for the damaged diggers? Looking at this, again, a really mixed poll, 18% property risk, 7% public liability. However, the 68% of you have voted for contract works. Miranda, what's the appropriate response to that?
So this is a little trickier, and I'm going to give you a typical lawyer's response. It depends. The presumption is that the two diggers are plant, either owned or more likely hired by Company A to carry out the contract works. So the simplest route is for Company A to look to its own contract works policy for cover. Whether Company A's contract works policy will depends upon the level of cover Company A has in place. So if Company A has a D1 exclusion, the diggers will not be covered because it excludes all losses arising from defective design. And of course, we know here the cause of the damage was the negligent design of the steel beams. So in that scenario, Company A then looked to trigger the structural engineer's professional indemnity policy, as we know that these policies cover negligent design. However, if Company A has a DE3 exclusion, then the diggers would be covered, as this only excludes cover for property which is defective. And we're assuming here that the diggers themselves aren't defective.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Miranda. Fourth question, what type of policy would respond to the contractor's claim for the inadequately designed steel beam? Looking at the poll, 95% of you have gone for professional indemnity insurance. Miranda, what's the correct response?
Yes, so professional indemnity policy. So this we know is the policy which is there to cover claims for negligent design. So Company A is likely to face a claim by its employer, and it'll be Company A's professional indemnity policy that will respond. So Company A can bring a claim against the structural engineer, triggering their professional indemnity policy, or it's a subrogated claim by Company A's insurer. There is a quicker option. So Company A could make a claim under its own professional indemnity policy here, and this would be via a mitigation of loss clause, and this would actually negate the need for Company A to have to wait for a claim to be made by the employer.
Great, thanks, Miranda. And then finally, what type of policy would respond to cover the employer's claim for damage to the window and bathroom suite in the older part of the hotel. And so looking at the poll this morning, again, very mixed bag, 25% public liability, 2% professional indemnity, 50% of you say property risk, 20% contract works, 4% have gone for employer's liability. Miranda, what's the appropriate response?
So this is another tricky one, and there are a few possible answers here. We're assuming that the unused part of the hotel doesn't form part of the contract works. So if the owner of the hotel is in possession of this part of the hotel and has the correct property risk cover in place, then the most straightforward route and easiest would be for the owner to make a claim against his own property risk policy. The owner's insurer can then bring a claim against company A, and because we know that the damage was caused by defective design of the steel beams, it would be the professional indemnity policy which would respond.
Great, thanks Miranda. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for joining Miranda, Sam and I this morning. Today we briefly addressed various types of insurance risk, and in our next session on the 19th of May, I will be joined by my colleagues Laura Johnson and Adrian Quinter, when we will be delving into more detail on the scope of cover of a professional indemnity policy in the context of construction risk. We hope that you will be able to join us on that occasion, and we wish you a good rest of the day.